too soon.
You could. I haven't even finished my monologue yet, and you're segueing.
He hasn't got to a point.
You're getting on your little segue.
You're saying you're bored with Scott already.
Yeah. Anyway, Scott, that's great. On to you, Ray. Hello and welcome to another Telecoms.com podcast. Just a reminder that if you're streaming the podcast via SoundCloud or iTunes, you can also watch the video on the site, and vice versa. If you're watching the video, you can stream it on SoundCloud or iTunes. This week, I'm lucky enough to be the filling in a light reading sandwich. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, I've got no Jamie, but I've got Ray and Ian here instead.
No jam in the sandwich.
Well, quite. Sorry, producer Pierre. Are you joining in now? Do we need another camera for you? Excuse me.
He's the mayo on the side.
Yes, indeed. He's the French dressing. Anyway, so this week we're going to talk about funding fibre, Vodafone's investment in Germany, among others. We're going to talk about Apple's grand ambitions and how it wants you to spend £1,000 on its latest phone. And lastly, we're going to talk about lots of clouds, specifically distributed ones. So we'll start off with you, Ian. Vodafone splashing the cash on fibre in Germany. Tell us why we should care.
Well, it's quite a big investment. It's 2 billion euros they're planning to spend over the next 4 years, I think. They've made quite a big push on high-speed services in Germany. Vodafone, they've sort of already claimed to be offering about 500 megabits per second to 2.5 million households. So they've really kind of taken that high-speed battle to Deutsche Telekom. And Deutsche Telekom has carried on losing market share very, very slowly, but it's carried on losing market share to cable operators, generally speaking, of which Vodafone is now the biggest following its takeover of Kabel Deutschland. So this week they've said they're going to invest 2 billion euros over the next 4 years. And there's sort of three elements to the plan. One is to sort of boost speeds to residential properties. So that's about 12.6 million homes, I think.
Inevitably, I seem to remember there was talk of gigabit.
So the idea is to get those speeds up to sort of gigabit levels.
Basically, you're not a real man unless you've got a gigabit network
service. Yeah, and then there's a component of it which is very much aimed at addressing business customers in sort of science parks. And they've said they'll work with a fibre to the premises specialist called Deutsche Glasfaser, I think it's pronounced.
It's easy for you to say.
I'll have a pint of that.
Yep. Which is interesting because it sort of makes you think about the sort of moves that Vodafone might make in certain other markets, such as the UK, for instance, where there's long been speculation about it doing something on the fibre to the premises front. Right. But it's always kind of grumbled about, access to open or not been able to get access in the way that
they had another moan, I think, this week maybe about
they did.
Yeah.
So in the same week they've sort of been complaining a bit about BT, and then the other sort of third element of the German plan is to kind of actually have new rollout in rural areas. So it's quite a substantial investment, and it would also help. The one thing that's really interesting about it, I guess, is helping to provide the kind of backhaul that you need for these high speed.
That's probably the number one reason they're doing it.
Yeah.
So is the term 5G going to?
The term
creep
5G
its way into the conversation?
Didn't creep its way into the. I mean, it was not mentioned at all in the press release, but I think that is certainly, as Ray says, possibly the most important aspect of
the
all
elephant
this, really.
in the room.
Yeah. So you use those FTTP investments to support your backhaul strategy, and what the problem they've had up till now in Germany is that they've not been able to get access to Deutsche Telekom's fibre networks on terms that they want.
So similar problem to UK.
Very similar to here.
Right.
Yeah. And they've relied very heavily on microwave in Germany, as I understand it.
Right.
Which various analysts think is not going to be up to the challenge. Microwave backhaul.
Right.
Yeah. In Italy and Germany, Vodafone's used a lot of microwave backhaul, and the trouble with microwave is that when 5G comes along, it's probably not going to be good enough. There are people who disagree with that, but
that would be the microwave.
That would be the microwave people.
Yeah. Ray, you were just sort of talking about the backhaul part of it, and 5G's coming. So it's all very well offering these great sort of over-the-air speeds, but if you can't support it sort of all the way back to the internet,
it's like having an incredible home Wi-Fi network where you're connecting from your TV, tablet and laptop and phones at 500 megabits a second, and then you've got a dial-up connection out of your home. It's completely pointless. So, but I think the operators like Vodafone are going about it the right way. They are stressing and highlighting the immediate customer benefits of having the fibre, which is the faster broadband. But at the end of the day, they have to make this investment at some point. I think Vodafone's being clever. It's found local partners to help in the construction, which is often, it's always the operational and process side of it that's the real pain in the backside for these kind of projects. And over the course of the next 3 years, every single mobile operator is going to have to do something of the same ilk.
Yeah.
So there's going to be a lot of money spent on fibre. And in fact, I think the fibre manufacturers, the Cornings of this world, are already reaping the benefits.
Indeed. No, I was just writing about that as well. There was another conference at which the CEO of Verizon was talking about various bits and bobs, and he was asked about a year ago they were going to do some massive amount of M&A, maybe with Chartered or something like that in the US. And he's sort of going, nah, I've gone off all that now. I don't fancy big cable M&A. Instead, we're gonna lay our own cable. And they made some announcement earlier on this year, didn't they, where they were going to spend about $1 zillion with Corning specifically on fibre. So there's a lot of that fibre talk, and I'm sure you're right, Ray. Initially, you have to sort of say that the short-term benefit is look at all this lovely bandwidth and you can download Game of Thrones in Super HD in 1 nanosecond, and isn't that great?
I can't wait.
Yeah, but it's just got to be done. I suppose the only question that occurs to me is: are we going to have lots and lots of parallel networks? If all the operators are investing in this fibre, are we going to have that sort of inefficiency? Or are they going to find some way of all having a whip round, having one great big network for everyone?
Well, there are various schools of thought on that whole. There's the sort of neutral host, I guess it gets called sometimes, model where you have one network and everybody uses it, but you eliminate infrastructure competition. Basically, you have to differentiate yourself in other ways on tariffs and do what insurance companies do. And
did somebody mention customer service?
Or customer service, perhaps.
I think we'll have a mix. I think there'll be multiple networks, but not a network for every operator.
Yeah.
And the advent of network slicing will enable network sharing over fibre in a lot easier and more secure fashion, but in much the same way as some mobile operators currently share the passive infrastructure, the mobile towers, and some don't. I think we'll end up with the same position with fibre.
Yeah, and
that's my school.
Another, I mean, what's interesting is one thing that you've seen happen in the US is the rise of these kind of tower cos, which are also becoming fibre cos now, like Crown Castle, snapping up fibre assets and buying small cell companies. I was talking to Bruno Jakob Feuerborn, the CTO of Deutsche Telekom.
Okay,
you're on fire with the old German today, aren't you?
Good skills.
Earlier this year, and
Count to 10.
he said he thinks one thing we'll see happening in Europe in the next few years is the emergence of fibre cos and tower cos, as we've seen in the US, as 5G comes along, because that's the only way it's going to be economically feasible, which is.
But they've still got to get the investment and the cash and sort of be willing to sort of roll those dice. I think we all agree it's a massively capital intensive thing.
It is. So you just got to find the investors who are prepared to have a return on that investment that's longer than 3 nanoseconds.
Yes. Yeah. So sort of
exist.
Middle Eastern sovereign wealth funds.
Sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, they like investments like that because it's a dependable return on investment.
It's either that or buy a football team. Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. One other thing that occurs to me with the need for all this...
Torquay United. Torquay United or some fibre.
Exactly. Or a bit of both. Content. So we were talking earlier about if everyone's sharing the same network, either if it's because they've all sort of had a whip round and built it together, or because it's through one of these independent sort of infrastructure owning companies, then you made the good point in that means that they've got to find other ways of differentiating. And Ray said maybe customer service, although perhaps with a degree of cynicism as they haven't got an awesome track record in that area. Can
only get better.
Well, quite. I think that's a good point. But when? There doesn't seem to be any hurry.
Some point in the near future.
There we go. And one other one that occurs to me, and this sort of slightly a bit of a tangent overlaps with another thing that's been going on this week, which is a broadcasting trade show over in Amsterdam, is content. On Telecoms, Jamie's been over there in Amsterdam. That's why he's not here now. I mean, presumably he's exactly. Presumably he's
making lots
definitely
of money.
he's definitely reporting and not in any way skinning up. Content. So we've got like in the States, we've got AT&T and Verizon investing content in here. We got BT buying up some football, all that sort of thing. And that's been quite in vogue for a while as a possible way of differentiating, of adding a bit of value, of getting a bit of margin, and all that sort of thing. And of course, if everyone's going to be now constantly streaming everything in HD, hence yet another need for these sort of big pipes that we were just talking about with this fibre investment. I was just wondering, two of you, I'll start with Ian, content as a sort of core part of an operator's strategy going forward. Do you think they're barking up the right tree there?
Well, I think they need it because everybody's doing it. So if you don't, you're going to lose out in the end. I mean, you see what's happened in the UK where, Sky's come from the TV market and into the broadband and telephony sectors. And so it sort of forced BT to kind of do something. And you see that dynamic, I think, happening in a lot of European markets where you've got cable TV companies and companies that have come from the sort of telecom sector. But I mean, I'm dubious about, I think they can do a good job of being content distributors and try and focus on things like customer services and getting the packages right, as Ray was saying. But in terms of actually developing their own content and producing content, I just think that's I think they're sort of they're never gonna play a big part in that sort of area. Really, I'm dubious about that. I suppose the Netflixes and the Amazons of this world now and what they're doing. I don't see telcos really being able to stand up there, partnering with those companies.
Very much so. Have a content strategy based around building an ecosystem of content partners, but don't try and make it yourself.
No, it does. I mean, you make a good point. Don't be a dilettante in it unless you've got a ton of cash. Because of course, Amazon 10 years ago, someone had gone, Amazon's going to be a big content player. Don't be silly. They're good for sort of sending me CDs and that's about it.
Yeah.
But then they have got a hell of a lot of cash.
Yeah.
So they can afford to make a big bet.
Yeah.
And there's not many others that can.
Well, the thing that I suppose some of the operators have made a big bet on is sports. BT particularly has driven up the kind of sums that get spent on sports rights and particularly Premiership football.
Don't think they made a compelling argument for the ROI on that.
No, I mean I think there's always a lot of analysts always ask about that. Does this make sense? This strategy of forking out billions for rights to screen the Premier League.
Or you could just do a massive acquisition like AT&T with Time Warner.
But
there's not too many of those.
There's not many. Yeah, there's no one really in a position to do that kind of thing apart from AT&T.
Do you think, Ray, AT&T will get sort of a good return on that investment, that acquisition?
Yeah, maybe.
Let's see, shall we? Time will tell.
Very much so. It's an impossible question to answer.
Oh, sorry.
I would say that if I had to bet money, I would say no.
Right, that'll do.
I think the strategy itself is a little bit odd in a way. I mean, because they've talked a lot about when it was first announced, that deal, it was doing things like they made this big thing about mobile TV and being able to have Game of Thrones on your smartphone.
What are people going to do when Game of Thrones is finished?
Yeah, well,
I'm struggling, just waiting for the next season, if I'm honest. Just sitting there twiddling my thumbs
wait till
every
2019.
evening, staring out the window longingly.
People will have to go back referring to Bergerac or
just because you're from the
British
Islands.
Bake Off or whatever it's called.
Cool.
Sorry.
Okay. That does lead me to sort of my second subject a little bit, which is Apple. You've been made some big announcements recently. One of the reasons there's a sort of segue there is lots of people have been wondering whether Apple's going to spend any money on original content. One, we were saying how not many people got the cash to do these things, but Amazon was one of them. Of course, Apple's cash makes Amazon's look like a drop in the ocean. I think the last look they had about $260 billion just sitting there.
Yeah, what are they going to do with it all? They don't like spending money.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's all sorts of issues regarding sort of repatriating. I think about 90% of it is held abroad.
Yeah.
And they've been trying to work out how they can bring it back to the US without paying a ton of cash, and they obviously haven't resolved that. I think Trump was originally making some noises about it, but like with so many of his noises, it seems to have come to nothing. But anyway, they got lots of money. It's not a core competence of theirs. Perhaps when Jobs was around, they could, because he used to be on the board of Disney or something like that. He got some idea about these things. But anyway, back to that announcement. The big announcement was this new iPhone, which costs a lot of money. But a lot of people were wondering whether they'd make a content announcement. Just to sort of finish that tangent, no, they didn't. They didn't make any content announcements at all. And the only Apple TV thing was ramping up to about supporting 4K. Yeah. And that was about it. And I was like, okay, jolly good. So, but back to the phone. The most contentious thing about the phone, certainly from my point of view and a lot of other people's, was the price. So this is the new sort of, the way smartphone analysts segment these things is by sort of price tier. And Apple's always dominated the premium price tier. And then the sort of next price tier down is, I don't know, sub-premium or whatever. And there you got people like you got things like the Galaxy S8 and other ones. But they've sort of seemed to have created a whole new tier even above that, which I think analysts are calling super premium. And presumably after that we'll have ultra and hyper and mega and whatever.
I am rich market.
Yes, well, quite.
We've had that though, haven't we?
What's that?
That the phones that cost 18 grand.
Right. Yes.
That brand that
the Nokia
failed.
One. Yeah.
The brand that failed.
God, I've forgotten the name of it now. It began with
Vertu.
V. There we are, Vertu.
Didn't need Google for that.
Go you. I bet you had one.
That's it. It just exploded my last brain cell.
Yeah, they weren't even smartphones. They were feature phones that just had sort of gratuitous diamonds embedded in them.
Yeah.
For the very conspicuous consumer. But they were like sort of 20 grand. By comparison, this one's a bargain. This iPhone X sort of super premium one. But it does come in in a way, it's brave of Apple. You call it brave if they weren't so avaricious. But they've come in at £1,000 at the starting point. So you can't, $999, of course, inevitably. So you can't buy one for less than £1,000. And then, of course, they charge, for increments of storage, for example, they charge a huge amount. I'm pretty sure that flash storage costs very little wholesale, but they charge about sort of £100 for each.
Why do you need all that storage anyway? Can't you just put it on the cloud?
Well, there is that. I mean, I personally, speaking for myself, as a parent, I like to have the reassurance of having at least one iPad with a ton of movies on it, which is basically a great way of getting my kids to shut up for very prolonged periods of time. So that's my answer to that question. And of course, as we all know,
that's a good move then.
As we all know, as telecoms journalists, you can't always rely on connectivity when you're talking about everything being in the cloud, much as we'd love to. So there's nothing like having it stored there. Anyway, that's my personal choice. You stick with the cloud if you want.
I was looking to segue into Ray's chat about the distributed cloud.
Well,
Too soon. You
could. I haven't even finished my monologue yet, and you're segueing.
He hasn't got to a point.
You're getting on your little segue.
You're saying you're bored with Scott already.
Yeah. Anyway, Scott, that's great. On to you, Ray.
Yeah.
So anyway, cut a long story short, £1,000. That's a lot, isn't it, Ian?
It is a lot of money.
Yeah. Would you shell out £1,000 on a phone?
No, and I think it's quite cynical, and it shows. I mean, I was just a bit underwhelmed by the whole announcement, because it seems that they're expecting people to spend a lot more money for not very much more, really.
Yeah. You weren't impressed by any of the new features?
Well, there don't seem to be very many. The main one that everybody's focused on is facial recognition.
Yeah.
But as a consumer, that doesn't really
Nightmare
sound
for
very...
identical twins.
Yeah. Exactly, it's identical twinsist.
I mean, why does a consumer care about facial recognition, that you can unlock your phone by looking at it instead of putting a finger on it?
I think you don't have to lift a finger. Quite literally.
It's easier, maybe.
Yeah, except that you still got to sort of angle it right towards your face and that sort of thing. I don't
think that's the sort of thing that's going to get people very excited, to be honest.
Well, it clearly hasn't got you very excited.
Maybe next you'll be able to speak to your phone and wake it up.
Yeah, well, that should be something you can do already. I think one of the reasons was supposed to be so that it could have this completely sort of sheer front face, so without a button on it and all that sort of thing.
The button, which I'm not sure is a great idea.
No, well, that's because now you can't do the fingerprint ID, which I've got used to on this Galaxy S7 I've got. So that's quite handy.
So some analysts have said, well, people might be worried about using facial recognition because of the security side of it. I'm not really sure that they would if they didn't seem to have any problems using their fingerprints, but but if you did want to use your fingerprint, you can't, because they've got rid of that feature.
Well, that's one of my sort of reservations. Apple tends to be a bit unilateral, a bit dictatorial about these things. Where we've decided
got rid of the 3.5mm socket for plugging.
We've decided that you don't want to use a headphone jack, and you don't want to use fingerprint recognition. That this is for the best. Just just be quiet and give us your grand.
And then other than that, there's not a lot of innovation as far as I can see. There's tweaks and improvements to things like camera functionality. I know that it's edge to edge now, the display.
And the OLED display is apparently as a component is about $100 more it's costing them.
Yeah, it doesn't do anything really dazzling that you would.
Reality?
Right, well, look,
I just think
the fourth wall's being broken again by producer Pierre. Augmented reality. What does it do for augmented reality, Pierre? Or are you just going to chuck that buzzword in for a laugh?
They're releasing the AR kit.
AR kit. Okay.
For
All right.
gaming.
Okay. Yeah.
But that applies across all the phones, so it's still it's not a strong one to justify the grand.
I think the other problem is that it just shows the iPhone's been their most successful product, I guess.
Just a bit.
Yeah. And they're just to me it seems like they need something new, and they've failed to do that. The Apple Watch has been a bit of a failure, I think.
Well, they have got something new. They've got a new price that everybody's talking about.
I
don't think it's brave. I'm not so sure it's cynical. I think it's just economics. I think that they obviously have a lot of people who have examined the elasticity of demand for the iPhone, and they've decided that they can ramp the price up massively to $1,000,
and people will buy it.
And the decrease in the demand for that phone will not match the increase in the price, and they will make more money.
No doubt.
End of.
I suspect you're right. I think the initial response anecdotal response from quite a lot of people is that's just too much, because it's a sort of threshold. It's psychological. Actually, the difference between 950 quid.
These are the same people
that
will probably go, all right then.
Exactly. I was just going to lead up to that point myself. I think
sorry. What does it mean?
No, it's fine. It's showing that we agree.
But I guess the important thing is how people buy these devices, because we've been used to very, very expensive device. Nobody goes out and spends £600 on a smartphone. I have an iPhone, even though I'm moaning about the new one, and it's I don't know what it costs the iPhone 6. It's what, 500 is it, the factory price? But you don't do that. You go and get a very expensive tariff, and even now those tariffs are coming down all the time, so it looks a lot better than it did.
Hence the marketing that's already started. Get your iPhone 8 for $0. Up front.
But what does it mean for the operators? That's the.
Yeah, well, I suspect for something like the X, or I think Apple wants us to pronounce it 10, which is why I'm going to pronounce it X just to annoy them.
Yeah.
I think you'll probably you've got to get on a 60 quid a month tariff, and you've got to whack out 300 quid up front as well. Type of thing will be how they do it. But
I've not looked at what is being offered for. I don't know if anybody's come out with their pricing plans around it or their tariffs.
No, in fact, there were some press releases about it today, but I couldn't be bothered to read them. I might have to go back to that.
That was the one where you can get it for $0.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Zero. I think it might have been £0.
Right.
So is it going to hit operator margins?
Well, they're always moaning about the cost of subsidy, but they've never done anything about it because they know it's a big driver. So I've always found the moaning by operators on the cost of subsidies a bit disingenuous. Years ago, there were a few people tried. I think in Spain, one of the operators just unilaterally went, "Nah, we're not subsidising it at all. You got to pay separate for the tariff and for the phone." And then they lost loads of business, and they went, "All right, we'll go back to it then." And it's pretty much as simple as that, I think. But yes, I think Ray's right. I think people will moan, and then they'll secretly sort of raid their piggy bank, and they'll find the cash. I think the other thing that's interesting, and that's the only reason I mean it's brave, is someone had to cross that threshold to 4 figures, and of course it would be Apple. And I'm sure you're right; they've done their sums, and it'll probably pay off massively. One way it could backfire, though, is the other ones, the 8s. So it also launched the 8 and the 8 Plus at the same time, as well as this X. And who's going to want to buy an 8? When there's this X sitting there that's much shinier and bigger and more expensive? You're going to feel like a bit of a loser with an 8, aren't you?
That would be me then.
No offence, mate.
So there's plenty of losers.
Especially if they do what Ray's just said, and if you can get this thing for $0, up front. I mean, that's the thing. Maybe the calculation about demand elasticity is that no operators, operators are desperate to offer Apple iPhones, and they've shown in the past they're willing to subsidise these things to the max, and they carry a cost for that. It has an impact on their margins, but they think
they get the money back.
They get the money back in the long run. Yeah.
You don't feel too sorry for them, then, Ray?
No. What? What, the struggling Apple empire?
No, the operators who have to subsidise
the struggling. I mean, let's face it. How many operators are losing money hand over fist and about to go out of business? Name me one.
Not off the top of my head. No.
That's because they're not. They're all making loads of money still. So
Stop moaning.
yeah.
Yep, I'm with you on that. One last point I'll make about the that point about the 8 maybe not being so attractive. Samsung has a similar thing. Their Note range, and they've shown some guts by sticking with the Note after the last one kept blowing up. They launched them about 6 months apart. The Note ones, which are like the sort of super high-end phablet, larger, more expensive ones, and they're not actually. While we're all dissing Apple for charging $1,000, the Note's about $950 or something like that. It's not that much less. But they have them 6 months apart, so I think there's less of a risk of the Note overshadowing the main phone than there is for Apple. But then if the numbers come out for Apple and it's selling an absolute shitload of all of them, then I'm just talking rubbish, aren't I? So we'll see. On that note, before I talk even more
I'm
rubbish...
sure we won't come back to it in 6 months' time.
Yes, indeed. That's what I always counted on when I was an analyst.
That's
No
right.
one ever remembers what you said.
Nobody ever looked back at a forecast.
Exactly. So your segue at last that you tried to
distributed
impose
cloud.
on us.
Right.
Yes, lots of clouds. I'm calling this. Ray, you're calling it distributed cloud. You've got a bee in your bonnet about a distributed cloud at the moment.
Not so much a bee in the bonnet. I just think we've reached the point now where we're going to start hearing a lot more about this topic. I mean, it's been creeping up on us. Whether you call it distributed cloud or whether you call it edge computing, mobile edge computing, whether you call it FOG, which is a term
multi-access edge computing.
I beg your pardon, multi-access edge computing. But the integration of IT storage and networking assets locally, when in a metro area, I think is something that we are about to, in the same way that we are seeing investments, and we'll see investments from mobile operators in fibre because they have to make it and they will need to make it. I think starting in 2018, I reckon we'll start to see announcements about how central offices are actually going to be or rebuilt or revamped into effectively mini data centers that also have networking equipment in them, and this will be the start of the distributed cloud. And ultimately, when we do get to that 5G era, the street furniture, which is a term I love, only because I like to think of myself sitting in a sofa while getting run over by a Land Rover,
like some kind of tramp.
That's right. Well, yeah. So now you sent me back to my youth. But the distributed cloud is going to be one of the main enablers of whatever you want to call it, 5G, 4.9G, whatever, and that services and that communications and that digital revolution will not happen without it. The big question at the moment, and I'll just leave it at this, is who's actually going to build that distributed cloud.
Pay for it.
The telcos have the opportunity because they already have some of the assets that can start that revolution. But if they fanny about for too long, then somebody else will do it, a Google or an Amazon, or the people who are companies or organizations that already own the physical assets that could be used to house essentially that distributed cloud, because you still have to put some x86 hardware and some storage somewhere. Someone will do it. Someone will do it first. And
what's holding the operators back at the moment? Is it the investment case for this? They're thinking about it, but it requires a huge capital outlay to get this.
But I think that they're thinking about it hard. And yes, of course, there will be huge capital outlay, but and this is where the ROI needs to be looked at very long term, and that is very hard when you're publicly listed, etc., etc. But the potential to own and be the main player in that distributed cloud means that the opportunity for adjacent new revenues to be developed and new services and new lines of business is astronomical.
Is it the sort of thing that the internet giants like Google would look to do?
They're already starting to do
those distributed cloud.
Google Fiber wasn't about providing home broadband.
No, and of course they're the ones that are the experts at building bloody great big data centers. So
using white box hardware.
So they know how to do that efficiently.
It cheaply. Yeah, it's all about process. That's what it's about.
So they've got that covered, but in principle, the sort of more telco-oriented companies would have the networking side of it covered.
And they have the real estate. Google does not have the real estate.
Right.
People used to refer to telcos as real estate companies that provided communication services.
Right.
And most of them still have
mean
that
like
real
tower sites?
estate. Central offices, those great big buildings, massive buildings
Right.
in every town.
So this is what Chord's all about, yeah? Partly,
Absolutely,
and
yeah. So this
Chord,
is the start of that central office as a
re-architected as a data centre.
There we go.
How does that overlap with what Etsy's doing with MEC and what's going on with FOGCIM? Seems like there's lots of people coming at this from different directions.
All with their own acronym.
It's not. It's not really all tied together just yet. But I think even last year, when you and I were at what was then the Mobile Edge Computing event in Germany, there was a little bit of talk about around Chord then, and I expect that when we're back at that event in a couple of weeks' time, that there'll be a lot more about it, because obviously that whole distributed cloud, the re-architecting of those data centers is going to be an integral part in it, especially now as there are very few pure mobile operators around. And in 5 years' time, there won't be any. They'll all be they'll either have built or developed or acquired their own fixed line assets, or vice versa. Yeah. So they'll be looking to do, Vodafone now is a massive cable operator, and this fibre that it's putting in isn't just to do backhaul or just to do broadband. It's to do all of it. It's an integrated architecture, and that's what we're going to see. And this whole distributed cloud will be part of that integrated architecture, and eventually the network will become a computer. That's where we're headed.
And this came up a bit, didn't it, at Ovum's event this week, the Digital Futures event, where I think Marcus Weldon of Nokia was talking about the need. I mean, a lot of the claims that get made about 5G in terms of low latency and how important that is to things like connected car services and certain other vertical market opportunities that get talked about. You can't get that latency unless you kind of re-architect the network.
Exactly. Do you know how far light travels in 1 millisecond?
Tell me.
100 kilometres.
Oh.
100 kilometres.
100 kilometres.
10 kilometres. God,
I dropped to
we
zero.
even spoke about it in front of the camera.
I know, that was days ago. I've forgotten.
So that was one of Marcus Weldon's points.
Physics matters.
Physics matters. And if we're going to, the other thing that's going to be a big deal about 5G is this very low latency, which enables things like remote control and virtual reality and all that sort of clever stuff. And you just physically can't do that if the signal has got to travel over thousands of kilometres. It'll take longer than a millisecond. So that was another driver. Yeah. For this
Without that distributed
cloud.
cloud, you could be throwing up everywhere when you don your 360-degree VR headset.
Yeah, that was a cool thing actually. That he did that demonstration on stage that's showing that one of the things, because apparently the human brain can only react to things in about 100 milliseconds, which is what he said was one of the reasons why that's always been the latency in the past. But one thing that we can do much quicker than that is the adjustment your eye makes. If you move your head around and I'm looking at you, and my eye stays fixed on you, if you think about it, that actually requires some kind of processing in your brain to tell me to keep my eyes fixed on you. And apparently that neurological
That's why getting drunk is so much fun.
Yeah. That's true, actually. Maybe
discombobulates you.
Maybe just VR without the right latency is just a cheap way of getting pissed. That's true.
There's a thought for the day.
Yes, well, that's probably a good one to end it on, isn't it?
Not so cheap.
So yes, on that note, we're all off to put on VR headsets for the evening.
Well, you might be. I'll go to the pub.
Excellent. All right, thanks for listening. Join us for the next one.